welcome to today's WBCA-NABC Coaches Forum on the topic of international recruiting. I'm Jose Fernandez, a women's basketball coach here at the University of South Florida, and I'll be serving as the moderator for today's discussion. Before I introduce this incredible panel, I'd like to take a moment and thank our partners at Marriott Bonvoy for their support of the WBCA, the NABC, and this Coaches Forum series. And now to introduce our panelists. Blanche Alverson is Associate Head Coach for Georgia Tech Women's Basketball. Dan Burt is the Head Coach for Duquesne Women's Basketball. Rafael Chilius is the Head Boys Basketball Coach at South Kent School. And Jasmine Player is the Associate Head Coach for Oklahoma State Women's Basketball. Thanks to each of you for taking the time today to share your wisdom and insight with the NABC and WBCA coaches. If time permits, we will take questions towards the end of the hour. So please send in your questions using the Q&A function. So we'll jump right in. And Rafael, can you speak about the influence the NBA academies have made in regards to the recruiting process of international student athletes, and also touch on the growth of international recruiting at the prep school level, junior college level, and the landscape of the amount of NBA players presently playing in the league from foreign countries?
Sure thing, Jose. And I'll start by saying the NBA academies in recent years are having a great impact, obviously, on the game and recruiting and making the world smaller. However, I would say prior to my experience when I was a prep school coach before being a college coach, is one of the first programs that started before NBA academies was NBA Without Borders. And that still involved Kim Bahuni and people at the NBA offices. And that was the first real program for the continent of Africa to really help underprivileged kids who played basketball to get to the United States. And my experience in 2003, I believe it was us and another school, prep school in Virginia, were the first to take two kids from the NBA Without Borders program, sight unseen, because the mission was to help a kid get to school. Basketball just happened to be something they did, and that actually turned out to be another player we had ended up being a Division I prospect at the end of the day when he was here. So I would say NBA Without Borders was a great precept before NBA academies, and also my personal experience with the international basketball piece that leads into that is I'm sure a lot of people have heard the story of Masai Ujiri, who's the in charge in Toronto Raptors, and Amadou Fall, who now runs all of NBA Africa. But at the time he was with the Dallas Mavericks. They started a program back in the early 2000s, late 90s, was called Giants of Africa. And they would go to various African countries and invite kids to clinics and learn how to play. And I happened to be one of the participants on one of those trips to Nigeria. And for me, I couldn't believe the amount of untapped talent that was just in that country alone on that trip. But I'll say getting to your question, the NBA academies, what they've done is they've moved from trying to help kids on one particular continent to making it more global. You know, as we know, there's an NBA academy in Latin America. There's one Oceanic, which is New Zealand and China and those schools. And there's a European team. And what's happened is we're seeing kids go through those academies and really learn in basketball two different ways. Obviously, the European style of play, we wouldn't want to change the way those kids are trained ever, because they're so skilled and they learn the game the right way early on. But they're also getting the influence from the academies, they're getting the influence of coaching and the way the game and the concepts are taught here in this country, so that when those kids have the opportunity to come over, perhaps they know how to play both ways. And I think since the NBA academies has done that, the kids who come out of the academies, who come over to the United States, are more quickly prepared to play in a college basketball game or a high-level prep school basketball game. Whereas before, and I'm sure all you coaches can attest to it, it's like when I was a college coach, when you got a junior college player, you always had to have a little extra patience for about 3 or 4 months until they adjust to the level and the style of play. And I think that's been tremendous. Obviously, with the global NBA academies having events during the Final Fours, men's, women's Final Fours, during the NBA All-Star game, it's put a spotlight on the international game of basketball. And I think it's helped it grow tremendously.
It's definitely become a global game. On our women's side, Blanche, Jasmine, Dan, any thoughts on the NBA academies and Basketball Without Borders on our side?
We really have not, Dan Burt from Duquesne, we've really not been involved with the academies for the NBA. And that's something that we're looking forward to do more of as we move into the summer of 23. For us, Mega, which is in Belgrade, and Basketball Stars in Australia, and the BLA are three places that you can find opportunities. You know, the BLA is men's basketball, but there's always someone there who has connections to women's basketball. Mega, which is where Jokic came from, my son actually attends their summer program. So I'm in Belgrade for a couple weeks in the summer with my son, and the amount of really good basketball players that come through there on both sides of the basketball is simply incredible. And I'm a big believer in that. Whatever academy that you look at, whether it's Mega or Basketball Stars or the NBA, trying to find reputable people there that can be contacts for you, sort of like the World Wide Wes effect, in a sense, where every academy or every country, you want to find at least one or two people there that really know the landscape of basketball, and you build relationships with them that hopefully they'll help in the long run with you getting good players.
Blanche, I think you're on mute.
So I would say one of the things that I've realized with the academies lately and just recruiting international, like the young women that go through these academies, is they're starting to also get to know each other. And then it's given them opportunities to come to the States together. And so I think it's giving them some of the international prospects we talk to, they start to say, well, yeah, I've been to the States because I came over with the NBA academies and I did that. So I think that's one thing that's been really interesting to me, is discovering sometimes their opportunities and the things they have been, places they've been in the States, and also then them getting to know each other through those academies also goes hand in hand, I think, with international recruiting too.
And if I could circle back, Jose, and add in another piece, I think the academies where it's taking it to a different level is that also those student athletes are being exposed to U.S. education while they're at those academies. And the NBA is very cognizant in making sure that the kids have all their core courses, but not just making sure they have the courses done, like check mark. They're making sure these kids are being educated, that they're sitting in the classroom, they're learning the language, they're learning the nuances of, how to navigate being in a U.S. school system. And I think that's been huge for those kids and for the schools they arrive at.
Thank you, Raphael. Jasmine, your resume speaks for itself. Your success recruiting international student athletes at different institutions. What has attracted you to the recruiting process in regards to international student athletes?
Thanks, Jose. Excuse me. I really appreciate being on here with everyone. I have my paper and pen like everyone else, writing down and learning. But for me, it started with region. I started my career working at the University of Maine. And at the time, a lot of the international kids we were recruiting didn't know the difference between being in Maine and New York City. So they just knew it was the closest place to Europe. And we were able to get in there and do a lot of recruiting, but I learned the landscape very early on in my career. And then regionally, I went to Los Angeles. And so it was really easy to recruit international kids to come play for you in LA. And then I kind of tested it a little bit with taking my talents to Kansas. But Kansas was a great sell. And then after COVID hit, I went down to Dallas. And by that time, COVID hit, so the portal hit. And now you've recruited all these kids the first time around and they're leaving their respective institutions, but you have already established connections. So you're getting them on the back end. Kind of the same thing here at Oklahoma State. The kids that I've recruited here, the international kids anyway, I recruited them at previous institutions in different regions, but the relationship has been built. So it began for me as a regional thing. And then honestly, this may not sound like it makes sense, but another thing for me that was really big was budget. When I was at Maine, we didn't have the budget to spend a lot of time in Europe. So we were watching FIBA games on YouTube. And I was doing it every single morning, watching multiple teams. You can go to FIBA, the website, and it'll give you the rosters. And I was just doing that every single day and coming up with lists of kids because we couldn't afford to subscribe to anything or get it on Synergy or go over to Europe. And so through that, it was just watch it on YouTube and Facebook everyone I could to figure out who I could talk to. So from a budgetary standpoint, that was really helpful for me early on. And I think, you know, during the summer, you hear it's really expensive to go over to Europe, but it's one long flight. They cost you $700-800. Hotels are cheaper. Flights within Europe are quite a bit cheaper, and you don't have to pay for those books. So one flight to Europe for us is going to pay for your packet to some other tournament here in the States. So I think if you really look at it from a budgetary standpoint, where I've been, it made a little bit of sense. The other big thing for me was kind of like standing out. I think it's a very different way to recruit. And so if you go sit on a sideline here in the States in the spring or in the summer, everyone is dressed like everyone is in the Zoom. It's a quarter zip with a logo on the side. So we start to all kind of run together to a lot of these kids. Where if you go to Europe, there are 15, 20 coaches, and it's easier to differentiate. Like when I call them or when I WhatsApp them or Facebook them after, hey, I'm the coach that was in the orange polo. It's easier for them to remember kind of who you were. So it was just a kind of a way for me to stand out in the business. And I think the last thing that kind of attracted me to international recruiting was I really value relationships with players and families. I think there are a couple things that you have to deal with when recruiting here in the States is now you're recruiting, you know, grandpa and mom and dad and trainer and high school coach and whatever AAU coach, as opposed to if you watch Giannis, you know what Giannis's mom looks like. You know Giannis's brothers, because when Giannis was recruited, so was his family, and all those relationships are with families. And so I really value if there's an issue going straight to mom or dad or that kid, as opposed to having to jump through the loopholes of everything else. And so for me, those were the things that were attractive. It was region, it was budget, it was standing out, and it was the opportunity to recruit directly to a player or to their caretakers.
And Jose, one more, Jasmine, that was great, and it jogged my old memory. I'd be remiss if I didn't say one of the things that also really grew the game on the men's side was when I worked at Nike, we started doing Jordan brand camps in Europe, and we found guys like Jonas Vassiliounas, Enes Kanter, so on and so forth. We found them when they were young, playing on club teams, and then we offered them the opportunity as part of the Jordan brand game, the All-American game. There used to be an international component that those guys came over. We picked 32 kids from different countries to come over and play in an all-star game prior to that. And that was obviously a greatly watched event. And that really exposed a lot of people. And again, like Jasmine said, it was regional. It was in New York City, it was in Madison Square Garden. And so now you have a lot of international kids who maybe not even been thinking about ever coming to the United States because they're in a good club program, right? But they see those kids got to go to New York and play Madison Square Garden. So I think that event opened up a lot of eyes in this country and in Europe regarding the ability to come over here and play and be able to show your talents.
Thank you, Raphael. Dan, Blanche?
I think Blanche, if you'd like to speak, I'm sorry. Okay. When we talked, we're talking about, Jokic and Giannis and Doncic and people of that sort. And I really look at it as with European recruiting, it's a blue ocean versus red ocean type of thing. We have seen blue ocean for many years in Central Europe and Western Europe. And that blue ocean has certainly turned into a red ocean over the last 2 to 3 years. And so I think that the ability for the Duquesnes and the Maines of the world to go over and find difference makers has become incredibly harder to do. With that being said, I'm a big believer in getting there for the younger kids and being there to see them. Many of the things that Jasmine mentioned, I would agree with. And let me say to the men's people that are on this call, this Zoom, I think Jasmine Player is the best international recruiter in America. And what Tommy Lloyd was to Gonzaga, I think she is to the women's side. I think she's absolutely outstanding. I've watched her career from her beginnings at Maine, and I'd really like to have some men's staff member there, get her on the radar of your men's head coach and hire her away and get her out of women's basketball so that we can find some players for ourselves. Jasmine does a great job. But getting back to the red ocean and the blue ocean, finding kids at younger and younger ages, like Raphael mentioned, you're going to have the Doncic's and the Jokic's, but there's other kids that are out there that develop at different times. I can think of one Hungarian kid that we had that was not a part of the national team process. She was an 18-year-old 6'3" post player that never played on the national team. Maybe politically, it was a reason why. It could have been she was from a small town or the wrong club, but she ended up being a very good Division I player. And I think that a lot of times the American coaches always talk about is the kid on the national team, and that is very important. But even in a small country like Hungary, which is 9 million people, but has a very good women's basketball infrastructure, those 12 players are all Division I players usually, but there's usually another 4 or 5 kids in that country that are good enough to help the mid majors and the smaller Division I schools in America, and you just have to find them. But with the way the NCAA rules are now, and so many high major Power 5 programs going over, it's sort of become in vogue to have an international player or two, whether they're good enough to play for you or not. And then also you have the Power 5 coaches who use it as a vacation. Oh, I can go to Greece and watch the U18s. Maybe I'll go to a game. Maybe I'll sit on the beach. You have all of those. So I'm a big believer. As the head coach, it's my responsibility to go. Because if I send a young assistant and she leaves me at the end of the year, that's losing intellectual capital. And so I'm the person that does the international recruiting for us. When business is done on the road, work is done in the office. So I have assistants and a graduate assistant who monitor everything from Eurobasket to the FIBA webpage every single day. But when business is at hand, I'm the person that's on the road because I'm going to be the person that's there. And I'm a big believer that it's not just a couple days in the summer. And Jasmine touched on that a little bit also. What are we doing in April with our polos and our quarter zips, and we're all at the same events? You're much better served zigging when people are zagging. And so I'm a big believer that if you're going to do international recruiting, whether that's in Canada or South America, Asia, or Europe, that you have to commit to it. It needs to be a 12-month process. Sorry about the length.
Yeah, and I can piggyback on that too. I totally agree. And visibility is really important. Like Jazz and Dan said too, is like when you're over there, it is a difference. You do stand out, but you have to commit to it. It's not just showing up to a tournament, going to the World Cup or doing things like that. It's committing to it and being visible. And that's one thing. Like I'm pretty new in the international recruiting world. I remember sitting at the panel and talking about building her own list and you be the list. I mean, that was super impactful. And I've carried that with me as I've gotten to Georgia Tech, and now we do heavily recruit internationally. And we are we have some players from Spain and we've had some from Latvia, and we're continuing to recruit, and those are kind of the red ocean, right? But I think too, and like you said, it goes a long way to also when you have a couple of international players on your roster and they build connections and relationships, it's just the same as recruiting in the US, but you have to commit to it and commit to being a part of that, being a part of what you do. And like for us, for example, I do a lot of our international recruiting. And so when people are out in April and May and July, I'm usually in Europe at some point doing that and really committing to that process for our program also.
You guys.
Hey, Jose.
Sorry, Jess.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. Okay,
Yes.
before we move on, I think one thing, just to kind of piggyback off what Dan said, there was a time there at Maine, we went in and we signed 3 Spanish players. 2 of them were national team players. 1 of them was not. One of them left Maine as the best player to have ever played at Maine, and she actually got a WNBA shot. So that kind of speaks to what Dan says. The great players aren't always on the national team, which goes to another big issue that I always hear is recruiting kids off tape. Get as much game film as you can and do your job and evaluate talent. And you have to evaluate the little nuances of talent. The kid we signed was the perfect player for our program. She can move well without the ball. Blanca Milan is one of the best players I've ever coached at any level. But again, at that time, we had a girl that played like Pau Gasol. She was great, but she didn't end her career at Maine. She actually hated it. And then we had another one who was a big guard, a 6-foot guard before, that was a thing at the mid-major level. And she didn't end her career at Maine either. So we had 3 shots at Spanish players. And the one who was not on the national team is the one who got me to where I am in my career right now, because we took a chance on that kid. So I would say get as much tape as you can and do your job. You sit in your office and you evaluate as much as you can. These kids are playing at least once or twice a week, maybe for their senior team, for their junior team. Sometimes the teams they're playing against are bad, but you have to kind of weave through all that and do your job and evaluate them well, even if they're not on their national teams.
That leads me to the next question, because there's a huge misconception in regards to budget and recruiting internationally. Dan, what's been your approach? Talk about the summer evaluation period.
For us, me in particular, I've really recruited internationally for over 20 years. And it's really about, to begin with, it doesn't have anything to do with money. It has everything to do with embracing the adventure. And this may sound a little bit hokey, but I kind of, call myself the Anthony Bourdain of women's basketball international recruiting. And what that means is that when I'm going to an event, I'm not just going to the basketball event. I'm there to make friends. I'm there to eat the strange thing that the guy is going, yeah, chicken. And I'm not sure if it's really chicken. I'm going to try to stay local. I'm going to try to do everything locally and not be at a chain. But with that being said, if you ever get lost, always know that the manager at McDonald's has to speak English. That's a rule. So I got stuck in Romania 20 years ago, and by God, thank goodness I had the opportunity to stop in and get some directions from a McDonald's manager. But, I think that what Jasmine said made a lot of sense earlier. With flights being more expensive this summer, and you're probably going to end up spending about $1,400 to get to Budapest or Paris or, one of the main gateway cities to where we would go for an international event, with hotel and your everything, you're probably looking at about $2,200 to $2,400. But when you compare that to an event in July where the book is $800 to $900, and you're competing with 300 to 400 other colleges there, as opposed to being at a European event where there's maybe 30, your opportunity to get more bang for your buck is certainly overseas. And so, for me, one of the things that we always do is that we create our own book. This is it right here. And that book has the rosters. It has vocabulary in there. And I think it's important that, as you go over, being able to speak 10 to 15 words of what the native language is there makes a difference. You're not going to get overcharged if you know how to say Shami boy, which is no worries in Hungarian. Being able to say please and thank you. Those little things matter. Many women's events are in Sopron, Hungary, which is an elite level of women's basketball professionally. And with Sopron in its location, you can either fly into Vienna or you can fly into Budapest or Bratislava. All 3 are pretty close. You're going to obviously play all 3 of those airports off of one another to see what your best rate is. But if you know that you're going to stay overnight, the Marriott or a hotel in Budapest is going to be more inexpensive than what you would find in Vienna. And your hotel in Bratislava will be even cheaper than what it would be in Budapest or Vienna. So many people worry about having a car when they're there. I'm fortunate that I'm actually married to a Hungarian woman, and we have a house and a car there. And so I have the access to be able to drive anywhere that I want. But when you're in Hungary and you're in Austria, you're in Italy, the train systems are so good that you do not need to have a car. If something would happen in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, or in Croatia, it's the bus system there. And I know that scares probably a lot of American coaches, but again, look at the adventure of it, and look at the fun of it. And I'm a big believer in, if you have the opportunity, the event starts on a Thursday and you're able to get there on a Tuesday, fly overnight on Monday and get there on a Tuesday to get yourself settled in. A lot of times your flight on a Tuesday is going to be cheaper than what it would be on a Thursday. And I would utilize that and be there early so you can get the lay of the land and be comfortable. I think, the big things are that, you need to do your plane tickets, your hotels, as much of that as you can in advance. Typically, the European Championships, FIBA Europe announces those in January, typically towards the end of January. And as soon as that happens, you want to get your flights and start flights and your hotels. Like I have an idea of where the events will be next year, and I already have my hotels. Like Jasmine said, you can recruit internationally in the summer and do it very cost effective, but you have to do some planning. And I know that I'm always available. And my associate head coach, Cherie Lee, who also does a fair amount of international recruiting for us, is also available if anyone needs us.
Well, the World Cup next year has already been announced, so it's in Madrid.
I know you're liking that, Jose. I think every coach is excited about that one.
Raphael, Blanche, Jazz, any advice in regards to the summer evaluation period as far as tournaments, evaluating, travel?
Dan, you hit on so many points in both your retorts, Dan. But one thing I would say, I'm going to use the word guys, but I really believe in something I say all the time, that everyday guys beat someday guys every day. And the international recruiting, you have to be a tireless worker. You have to be willing to miss some sleep, to be on a WhatsApp call or a FaceTime or whatever it is with the people who matter in those countries. And I would say at those big events, try to figure out, even when they're with the national teams, usually there's a club coach involved with one of those national teams or some feeder program that the national teams is pulling most of their kids from. And you try to get to know them when you're on the trips, and especially I remember when the U17s were in Utibo, Spain. Well, Zaragoza is right next door to Utibo, and there are a lot of kids in one club team that have a gym. And so if you can get to see a practice of a club team. I learned a lot. Dan, you talked about Belgrade. I went out to Himmel Farm, and my job was to go to see Darko Milicic. But I met one of those guys on the ground in Serbia who kind of became my driver for the week when I was working at Nike. No, in fact, I was still here. I was a prep school coach. My first time I ever went to Serbia. And this guy drove me around. He took me out to Himmel Farm. And he was just like a local driver. He goes, as best as he could in English, goes, Darko's not the best player. Wait till you see this program. And I went in there. I literally came back and said, Darko Milicic is not the #1 player in the world. NBA draft. There was 16-year-olds. And you know who was also in the gym? He was 12-year-old. It was Boban that plays for Dallas. Boban was in that gym and came in. So you never know what you're going to stumble on if you work when you're there. There's time to see things, maybe before or after the event if you can. But when you're there, just try to work every angle. Watch who's talking to who, because you find out who's important versus who's talking and saying they have all the connections with the people, with the kids. So I think that saves you time and money, actually knowing who's who and actually not coming over there and being a taker, but learning, like Dan said, learn some of the language. I know Dobro Libre, I know all sorts of things from being in Serbia. Speaking a little bit of the language helps, but getting to know the people who really make things happen is vitally important during those periods and when you travel throughout the year.
One of the best World Cups, and I know that was the only year that they did it, was in Zaragoza, where you had the men and the women at the same time. So you could stay after a women's game and watch a men's game, right? And see Argentina play Italy. It was amazing. Blanche, why don't we talk about some of your strategies in what after the summer, heading into the fall, September visits, evaluations. Talk about that fall recruiting period and how you approach it.
Yeah, so I think one of the best things that happened with the NCAA is allowing us also to go over and not worry about having it be scholastic. You can go over to clubs, because not all of the international kids you're going to recruit go to school and play. That's actually very rare. So being able to now navigate more freely in Europe and everywhere it's opened up a little bit, and we can kind of use our days now how we want to, which I think is super helpful. So I know for me, for example, when we talked about this, even in the summer, talking about budget flights, when you being able to take time and set aside time in the month of September during the contact period to go over to Europe, and you're taking one long flight, but travel's really easy when you're over there. So making really great use of your time. And I remember last year I went to Spain, Finland, and Estonia, and really taking a week to do that and spend time, because also not just flying in and real quick and seeing people, but really diving into the culture, having those conversations, figuring out who's a part of their process, meeting the kids in person that you've been talking to. And even for a younger kid, if you go, they're able to see you there versus just on film through WhatsApp or Zoom calls. So that visibility of showing up, again, it's not, once you look after the one big flight, the travel once you're over there is very efficient and effective. So that's a lot of my strategy in the fall, is really going over there and being able to sit down, and also then networking with the people in the places that you are going to, the director of the basketball academies in the different places, going to lunch with them, spending time with them, and really getting to know the people who you're recruiting, because then they have a connection with you. And again, it's all about relationships and when it comes down to it, and really diving into what that looks like. So I know strategy for me is really going over, being visible, being seen, and also continuing that networking business we would here in the States, and being able to spend time and get to know the recruit and their families and really relate to them in that way.
Thank you, Blanche. Jasmine, Dan, Raphael, September period, home visits, visiting club programs, visiting coaches.
I think for me, one big thing, and I can share a story, is like, if you can afford to get over, get over. And it's almost like July. There was a time, pre-COVID, where I went to Europe, and on this one trip, I did London, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Estonia, Spain, Greece, Portugal, and then I came home. I came home with 4 kids signed. All right. One of those kids is a really, really good player. And I think I'd been recruiting her. She was hard to recruit, wasn't very confident in her English. She thought I was a scam until I showed up in Greece. And her parents stopped by the hotel. Once they could touch me and realize I was real, I put her on a FaceTime call with my head coach, and I left with a commitment from the kid. So if you can get over, Jose and I hanging out in Estonia together, neither one of us got the kid, but go over, because if you can figure it out logistically, you get to, like Raphael said, I ended up riding from a high school with a club owner, who now I know that if I ever go back to that country, I can call him, he'll come pick me up, we're in his Audi, and he's getting me to and from the hotel, things like that. I was jealous. I'm still newer in this, and Jose and I were in Estonia together. Well, I knew I was in bad shape with this kid, because I had to catch a plane and catch an Uber to the gym, and Jose came with someone that was affiliated with the player who was a coach at the time, or knew he was a men's coach that he knew. And then I was in the gym like, oh my goodness, I'm in this random Uber and Jose has this in, and that's why I'm still chasing Jose, right? But when you get over and you can establish those relationships, then they speak. They really do, because those people are in your corner and they're always helping. So just finding any way in is really helpful if you can get over there.
I would say a couple things. I think there's so many coaches now that are going over to create relationships, that to build that relationship and have that depth, you've got to think a little bit outside of the box, and it needs to be, you may not get that player. It may be the next player who's 13 or 14 years old. And so, learning to speak 10 or 12 words and going to Wikipedia and understanding the difference between a Serbian and a Bosnian and a Croatian means everything, especially to this generation, because it was their fathers that were fighting in the war against one another. And there's still animosity there sometimes. Those things matter. When I first got into international recruiting, I was at West Virginia University as an assistant 25 years ago. Yes, I'm that old. When I got into it, there was a gentleman, it was during the Yugoslavian breakup, and there was a gentleman there that was trying to get Serbian players to America. And I didn't understand. I didn't know if it was a scam. I didn't understand, to use your words, Jasmine, I didn't know if it was a scam or not. I didn't know what was going on. But one of the things that I found is that, especially with what is happening in the world today, is that players that are from areas that are war torn, in a sense. So we're going to be talking about the Ukraine right now and Belarus. Those kids are literally doing anything they can to leave to come to America or to another country for safe passage. I think you have to look at that. And then I think you have to look at the economic factor of things also. I keep going back to Hungary because, my wife is from there and my children are citizens. But right now, the Hungarian forint is incredible for the U.S. The U.S. dollar is incredible there. It's almost double what it normally is. So what you can do in a country like that, or in one of the former Yugoslavian countries, your U.S. dollar just goes so incredibly far this year that, you want to take advantage of that as you're recruiting. And then understanding that, kids that are from areas where there might be political instability, they want to get out of those areas. And we're talking a lot about Europe right now. But there are other places that you just never know where you're going to find a player. Moldova is a country that people don't even realize. Georgia, the stands. Actually, Georgia has more players on the men's and women's side than I think people realize that are at the Division I level. Yes.
Zaza.
Yes, exactly. And his friend Lasha is someone who's really helping those kids get over. And so I think it's important that, again, that red ocean is the former Yugoslavian countries. Right now, Sweden has a ton of kids that are coming over on the women's side. France and Spain have always been that way. I think a lot of people have discovered how good the Hungarians are. That's where I think you have to look at other countries. Albania has opened up, and they may not have a player right now, but you never know in 2 or 3 years. But I do want to say one thing. Raphael, you talked about Hemo Farm.
Yeah.
And Darko.
There it is. There it is.
This is actually Darko's jersey. I got it from him when he gave it to me when he was in his first year at training camp. So I just want to show you that.
That's awesome.
Those kind of connections matter.
Absolutely. And I would say two quick things. I truly believe the best recruits are the ones you have. And if you're taking care of the international recruits you have, it opens up a pipeline in their particular place and people they played against. The best recruits are the ones you have. And then another thing that helps you when you're in Europe or Africa, wherever it is that as an American coach, if you can display a great deal of humility that we don't know everything.
Yes.
And you're asking them legitimate questions about things that you want to grow at as a coach and why they run certain things and why the game is played this way and that and the other. If you show humility, because we get this myopic view about ourselves, we think the world sees us one way, they see us another, especially, like Dan, a white man coming over, they think that you're going to tell them what to do.
Yeah. And
all of us, they think we're going to tell them what to do in terms of basketball. But if you come over and show a great sense of humility, that you're there to learn and not only just to recruit, I think it goes exponentially for you.
And that not just is on the court, culturally, knowing, that a lot of kids that you're recruiting out of France could be Muslim, of the Islamic faith. If you're going to recruit a kid from Bosnia, they're more than likely going to be Muslim, and understanding their differences that they may have and celebrating those differences and embracing those really does matter.
Thank you. Raphael, and I know all the entire panel will chime in on this. What are your thoughts on the transfer portal and the international student athletes receiving professional opportunities more on the men's side, right? and assisting or hindering the recruiting of international prospects? So twofold question, the portal and dealing with on the men's side, going to the professional route early.
Well, I think my thoughts on the portal and a lot of coaches' thoughts on the portal have changed since the entree of the portal. If you haven't embraced the portal yet, you're in trouble. It's just, but to me, it's different strategies of how the portal needs to be used from a stateside kid and an international kid. If I'm at a place where I know I have time to build it, I'm probably going to use the portal a little bit less early on so I can bring some younger kids in and establish our culture. Culture is everything, and sometimes I think with the portal, you could end up having a better team for a year or two, but you may denigrate your culture, right? And what I learned from here, the first time I was here, there was one year I had 9 international players, all from different countries. And like Dan said, Nigerians and Senegalese they're not necessarily enemies, but when it comes to sports and stuff, it's war between those guys.
Yes.
And so I found that I learned quickly, I have too many on my team at the same time. And so the vogue thing might be to go international, but you have to be very, very calculated in how you're going about it, that you're making sure you have pieces that fit in terms of players, but then culturally and socially, they fit as well. And so with the portal, I think with the international kids, as all you know on the phone, you have to be early because there's an incredible process that needs to happen for them to be eligible here. There are steps in terms of certification during the process that has to be done. So you just can't, I lose a kid in the portal, I'm just gonna go yank this international kid unless all their stuff is packaged up and ready to go and the NCAA is ready to clear them. Has their club team put together the financials to show that this player is not, they're on a professional team, but they're just getting the necessary expenditures and all that stuff. There's a huge, so I think with the portal, you have to be prepared that you're sitting on one. I call it my last name is Chili's, I call it the chill box, right? When I was a college coach here, I always had a player sitting in the chill box in case we didn't get the guy we wanted, right? But I made sure that kid was all buttoned up. And when I presented to the head coach, hey, we didn't get such and such, but he's ready to go right now. And I feel the same way with the transfer portal international students. You have to have yourself a deep chill box, so to speak, of people to go to should someone leave out of the transfer portal. And then as we know, the international student athletes have actually greater opportunities to be a professional once they're with us than American kids, because they've come through the club systems and they're a citizen of that country, or they're part of the EU, they can play in another country. So I think you always have to be prepared that maybe your best European player might walk in and say, Coach, I'm leaving. And you think, oh, they're transferring to XYZ. No, I'm going to go play professional for Real Madrid or Maccabi Tel Aviv. You have to be constantly aware of that. And again, that is being close to your players and understanding what are the what ifs. We always try to plan on, no, this is going to happen. But what if this happens? And so I think that's where the portal actually helps. And you could be hindered. The second part of that question, Jose, is what I said before, just thinking that you're just going to go grab an international student athlete if they have not been through, if you're not working with them with their core classes to make sure they can get through the certification process. It's a process. It's literally a process to get an international student athlete.
I think, Jasmine, you touched on this. Maybe you don't get that kid the first time around, but you laid the foundation the first time you recruited them, and then you get them through the portal.
That is what I am banking on right now since COVID. In pure transparency, the kid that both Jose and I were in Estonia to see didn't come to me. She's with me now. And my fight was with Jose, and thankfully he couldn't take her. So I have her now, but that's the reason why. She was familiar with me. I'd been to Estonia to see this kid. The foundation had been laid. It's the same with me with a kid at SMU. I recruited that kid when I was at Maine, and she put her name into the portal. She's probably the best player in the American Conference right now, with the exception of Jose's kids. She's giving them a run for their money, everyone in that conference, but I wouldn't get that kid on the back end had I burned any bridges on the front end. So right now, because of the portal, that's what it is. And I think they tell you no and you take no a little better from them because there's not a lot of politics going on. If you recruited a kid in their family and they say, hey, I thought this was better, great luck. I wish you the best. But I mean, let's be real. Statistically, a large number of these kids going into programs are hitting the portal. So that's kind of where I've been these last couple of years because I haven't been able to go to Europe as much as I'd like to, but I've gotten portal kids.
I would say too, from even just as short of a time as I've been recruiting internationally since being at Georgia Tech, we've had that situation come up where a kid hasn't decided to come here, but then in the spring, and like you might know in the back end, like that's not going to be a great fit for you. Like, but they made that other decision, but then they're calling you back. And I think one of the biggest things is also being careful of having too many. We try to be mindful of that. Because also, too, you don't want to recruit players from the same country and have them come in and compete on your team for spots, right? And that's one thing that we try to be mindful of is like a kid wanted to transfer, but I signed a kid in her same position from the same country. Out of the respect for the incoming freshman, we passed on the portal kid who we had recruited the first go around to not create some sort of bad blood or issue on our current team. So then maybe that kid leaves, right? So we try to be really mindful of that here and just recruiting. But also, too, like Jazz said, those relationships that you build, you're not going to get them all. You're not going to bat 100% recruiting internationally, but they are going to come and they're going to come and it might not be the best fit for them some places, but then you might have the chance to recruit them in the back end.
Blanche, I'm going to go right back at you because we got about 15 minutes left, and there's so many topics that we can touch on, but this one comes up a lot, right? Jasmine talked about, we can go back to that after this question in regards to evaluating off of film, right? But scouting services, Blanche, how do you use them? Do you like them? Do you don't like them? And how do you utilize them?
Yeah, so I'm fortunate here that we do have the budget to have some scouting services, and I utilize them in a way that it helps me have an idea of maybe like who to watch. Or, hey, someone else has seen this kid play before and now there's an evaluation on her. Never blindly trust the scouting service, right? Do your own research. That'll get you in trouble if you're just blindly, yes, this kid, sign him up. But that's one thing that I've learned too is ask your questions. Those relationships, not only with the player, but the scouting service you have, ask questions, do research. And then I use it just like here in the States in terms of this is giving me a good list to go off of to try to look and see, but also use your own eye, watch as much film as you can, get their club film, get their national team film, watch. If you can't go to the tournaments, watch their full games. Don't just go the highlights that you're sent through the recruiting service, right? But that's one thing too. The recruiting services to me are great relationships. Utilize them, be very transparent. If you're going to get the recruiting service, get the most bang for your buck, utilize them, communicate with them, be very transparent about what you need and what you're looking for. So that way they can help you in terms of, hey, this kid from Hungary or this kid from Croatia, that would be a great fit for your system. Because again, we don't want to bring them here to the States and then they don't fit. They might be really talented, but do they fit your system? And I think that's one thing, being very clear and transparent with the scouting services that you do decide to go with on what you need and communicate with them clearly and directly. And again, it's not just hey, I saw this kid in July. It's the constant communication, just like you would in the US as recruiting. You have to commit to it. So once you decide to go with those recruiting services, communicate with them directly and often and figure out, who really is going to fit your niche and what you're looking for.
Anyone else on adding about scouting services? I know they can assist with, laying the groundwork, whether a kid's going to go professionally or not, and assist with contact information. Anyone has any other thoughts on the scouting services? A lot different than our scouting services here domestically.
Jose, I think you make a very good point there. I'm a big believer in one particular gentleman, Dan, who I think does a very good job. We do not subscribe to any scouting services. We just can't do it financially. But I think if you have the resources to do it, these scouting services are popping up in every country. sometimes multiples in each country. But I'm a big believer in someone who knows the American game a little bit, who's been here a fair amount. And that's why a guy like Dan Bowmaker to me is very valuable. But unfortunately, we just can't afford to do it.
I would say this for all the on the men's side for sure is do your homework on the scouting service person, because a lot of those guys are actually the players' agents, for European kids too. So there's extra incentive for you to buy their service and to take this particular kid. So make sure you're doing your homework on all of that as you, especially internationally, as you try to jump into recruiting, because it's a lot like here. There's a lot of people who have an angle. You just got to make sure you understand what the angle is.
I'll just piggyback a little off what Blanche said. Once you pay for the service, and we're fortunate enough to pay for a couple. I have a couple favorites. Use them as resources. I don't mind reaching out to whoever I'm paying and saying, what are your thoughts on this kid? I know what mine are, but what are yours? And there's a question here about size. Try to get out and see them if you can. If you have a service, go out and ask, and then compare sizes in different places. I mean, if you look at our rosters, we list our sizes off by an inch or two as well. So if you want to, just go ahead and subtract an inch or two and then assume that's what you're going to get. But in terms of recruiting services, reach out to them if you're paying for them and ask them. Ask them as much as you want. Even if you aren't subscribed right now, ask them questions if you can, because they want your money anyway. So they'll probably answer them on the front end just to hope that you'll work with them on the back end. But there have been players I've recruited that I subscribe to a lot of services and they don't know some of these players. And that's Europe. I sat in the country a couple of years ago and I knew how good this player was because I'd watched her play 16s and 15s. But when I got to the tournament, I'm talking to service people who are like, there's no one on this court. And that kind of goes back to what Dan said. Make sure you're watching. If you're there, go watch everybody, because there are hidden gems on some of these teams that are not Spain or France or Germany. Like, make sure you do the groundwork.
Especially Division B, right? A lot of people don't go watch Division B, and that's where the gems are. All right. So we're going, how about some best practices dealing with club coaches, some red flags, some do's and don'ts? Who'd like to take that one?
I would say don't assume everyone just is like wants to help you. Like really dive into relationships and like get to know them. Like Raphael said too, like ask questions, but also like don't act like you know everything. And don't assume that everyone wants their kid to come over. Really start finding out who the player is, what their connection is. Do they want to come to the US? That's another way to utilize a scouting service too, asking questions. But don't just assume everybody wants their player to come over to the States. So really dive in and build relationships, and don't just assume everyone's going to help you.
And I like
in Europe, I should say, or everywhere, but
I like Jasmine told the story of her and Jose being in Estonia together. Find one of your competitors that is really good at it, and they've been around. And sometimes you work with the kid. Like, when I was in the Pac-12 as assistant, I had to deal with one of the head coaches. If we didn't get a kid, if we're recruiting the same kid, and once we figured out we were out, or he figured out he was out, we'd help each other try to get that kid. I think it's the same thing as you do in international scouting. Don't have humility about yourself that you ask someone questions, and yes, assume maybe they might use the question I asked them against me or whatever, against our school. But that's a really good practice to have, because you guys might come together and have the same story. Oh, you know what? That guy is legit, or she is legit. I was thinking she wasn't. And you might have verification, might confirm, but a lot of times you might confirm, yeah, we don't want to go down the road with that one because this is the experience I had with it. So I say that's a good practice to have. And another good practice to have is once you've had someone from a club program. Well, I'll go back. When we had team camps and things like that when I was in college, I always made sure that we invited JV coaches and JV teams, because, and especially from teams that may not have someone who's going to be good enough for you, but those coaches have seen those kids and they've played against those kids, and they're going to remember you, and they're going to pick up the phone and call you, hey, have you seen such and such from here? It's the same way there. Like, the people that maybe you've missed on a kid from, maintain that relationship, because they might be able to tell you about a kid that's not in their program, but one they saw playing somewhere and say, hey, coach, I think you might have a shot to go get that one. So don't be the express line, the one type shopping. You go somewhere and you don't get a kid from someone, and now all of a sudden they don't hear from you until 3 or 4 or 5 years. They have another kid you want. Keep that relationship, because sometimes they're going to lead you to a kid that's not even connected to them.
I believe that you combine it for what both Blanche and Raphael said. It needs to be deep and varied relationships that may not be fruitful in year one. And so many people that dive into international recruiting, want the best player from a particular country in year one, and they don't even know how to say hello or how are you in that recruit's language. And so, varied relationships we've only talked about club coaches here. And one of the things that I've found is that the trainer knows the kids as well as anyone. And they know everything from their phone numbers and social media to, is this a good human being? Is this a kid that's in the gym a lot? And so for me, one of the things I always look for is try to build a relationship with the trainers of the national teams of where we recruit. And I don't scatter and cast a far net. Because of my relationships to Hungary, I recruit the countries that touch Hungary. And then I add Bulgaria to that, simply because we've had a lot of Bulgarian players in the past that I've coached. So I think it's important that as you go into this process, that casting a wide net may not be the best thing for you to do. And it might be something where if you know that you are if you're in Buffalo, New York, and you know that there's a direct flight from Buffalo to Istanbul, well, why would you not recruit just Turkey? There's a lot of good players in Turkey. And if you're a mid-major or a smaller Division I school, you can fly out of Buffalo on a direct flight for under $1,000 to Istanbul. And so, doing something of that sort, but deep and varied relationships are what really matters in the whole process. And understanding this is an investment that doesn't happen after just 1 year, typically. It's a multi-year thing. In the case of Jasmine, like I mentioned, I've never seen anybody do what she did at Maine. How she threw herself into that process with the depth of her knowledge from the FIBA channel and on YouTube was it was outstanding. I still talk about it with my staff and others to this day. And, if you do that, you might get lucky and get some kids in year one. But deep and varied relationships really are what matters.
Okay, quick, before we wrap up, this has been amazing. Some final cost saving measures for international recruiting.
Airbnb it, stay local, really dive in. When you travel, obviously buy your flights early, like Dan said earlier, do your research, buy your flights early. And then, like he said, too, stay local, ask around if you need some help, but
Eat out of the grocery store. Take the bus. I'm a Marriott guy, so it's hard for me to do an Airbnb, but some of those Airbnbs are really, really nice. But at the end of the day, I do like my Marriott. So that's one place where I do splurge. But just know that if you're willing to make a financial investment to recruit overseas, your costs are going to be a lot less than if you would be going to any of these big events that we see every coach going to in the summer. But you have to have a head coach who's committed to doing this, who's willing to go over, possibly in the fall. And if you have a head coach who's not willing to do that, it makes your life 10 times more difficult. If you are an assistant coach and you want to dive into this might be your, like at Google, my wife works at Google, and they get a certain percentage of time to work on a moonshot project. This might be, as an assistant, your moonshot project where you say, my head coach isn't really interested in this, but I'm going to find everything out that I can about Spanish basketball or Great Britain or whatever country you want it to be. And so that in turn makes you much more valuable as you try to go up the coaching ladder. So for assistants, I would tell you, if your head coach is not interested in it, look at it as a moonshot project and do it on your own.
I just say really quickly, use the people you know who are there. There are only 30 of us there. If I caught a ride with another assistant from one country to a complete different country, I'm talking through customs, we're in a taxi. We knew about 6 words. Our phones weren't working. We were using Google Translate. She and I got in there together and we literally rode from, I don't remember where we were coming from, but we ended up in Macedonia. It was probably a 5-hour ride, but like use the people that are there. I get that it's really competitive, but we're all there for probably 7 to 10 days. Use the people who are there with you and split travel as much as you can. I'm a Marriott girl as well. But that's the one piece of advice I'd give.
I would say know who you are. You know, there's be certain players on the men's and women's side that, you know, everyone in the country is going to see them, you know, and it's the first time for first time international recruiters is that find yourself a good player. That good player might turn out to be a great player for you. You know, you don't have to go and make a big splash with your coach or you're trying to make a splash in this business because you found the next whoever it is. Know who you are and don't waste your head coach's time by spinning their wheels. Go find yourself a really good player who fits your system, that you're confident that if they do everything they're supposed to do, and we do everything we're supposed to do to develop their talent and they're going to work, you're going to have a really good player. So focus on going and get a good player and not necessarily, I got to make a splash.
Good point.
Thank you,
before we
guys.
finish,
This has been- Go
Jose,
ahead,
I'm gonna just
Jeff.
piggyback off what he said really quickly. I think I've kind of gone through that. You have to be laser focused though, because just like there are international recruiting services, there are American recruiting services. And I went to a level at one point and I recruited a whole lot of kids that were international and none of them were ranked in the States.
Yeah.
So my head coach really took a shot on me when I said, hey, I think these 4 international players are better than some of these American players we can get right now because of where we are in our program. But then when the rankings came out, we weren't in any of them.
Right.
But that program is doing pretty dang good today. Okay, so just make sure that like you can't get lost in the newspaper clippings because sometimes it doesn't look like the hype. You do your job. Okay.
I can't thank everyone enough. This has been just tremendous. I want to thank you guys for being on today's webinar. I also want to thank our partners at Marriott Bonvoy for their support. If you missed today's webinar, the full replay will be available in the coming days at WBCA.org and NABC.com. Thank you for tuning in and good luck to all of you for this upcoming season and spending this hour talking international basketball. Thank you.
Thank you.